How hijab oppresses women. We have encountered historical phenomena against women that are shockingly repulsive, and most of the oppression against women and girls had not been well documented. One such horrifying practice of degrading women took place in India, where women were not permitted to cover their bodies. Women from lower castes were not allowed to cover their breasts and were taxed heavily if they did so. It was a common practice to levy breast tax on lower caste and untouchable women who wanted to cover their breasts. Women in India have always been victims of sexual and caste discriminations, but the breast tax was imposed on women and was levied till 1924. In order to collect this tax, Hindu officials collected tax from every house that contained a woman who had reached puberty. The collector would examine the size of the breasts and impose a proportionate tax. This humiliating practice was solely for the purpose of subjugating the lower castes, thereby maintaining the caste class status quo. Bare breasts served as an identifier for women belonging to lower castes, and the tax had to be paid in exchange for removing this identifier, as this cruel social tradition forced women to remain shackled by gender inequalities. The religion of Islam, however, declared that women and men had equal rights and dignity, and had to be treated with respect. Islam valued education, and especially called on women to be literate and educated. In fact, the greatest and most popular scholars of Islam had been women, such as Aisha, Hafsa, and Khadija. Muslim women often surpassed their male counterparts in excelling in higher education. In the year 859, a Muslim woman named Fatima al-Fihri founded the world's first university, known as the University of Qur'an, which housed one of the world's oldest libraries. According to UNESCO, the University of Qur'an is the oldest operational educational institution in the world. The university produced great thinkers such as the jurist Muhammad al-Fassi and Leo Africanus, a renowned traveler and writer. The university's outstanding caliber attracted Gerber of Auvergne, who later became Pope Sylvester II, and went on to introduce Arabic numerals and the concept of zero to medieval Europe. One of the university's most famous students was the Jewish philosopher, theologian, astronomer, and physician, Maimonides. Alongside Islamic jurisprudence, subjects that were also taught at the university included grammar, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, history, geography, and music. Despite these phenomenal achievements, some ignorant men and women who dislike Islam work unceasingly to spread false narratives about Muslims and tell blatant falsehood about Islam. They continue to insist that Islam oppresses women, when in reality, Islam was the first liberator of women. 14 centuries ago, Islam gave men and women the right to cover their bodies and conceal their hair. The Islamic religious law stipulated that everyone has the right to wear whatever they please, and dictating a woman's clothes is an unacceptable act. Some Muslims feel that Christian white men oppress women by forcibly stripping their women, and those Muslims think that European women have no choice but to remain unclothed in order to please Christian men in clubs or strip bars, but this concept and generalizing is wrong. Most women in Europe become strippers or dancers or sex workers at their own will, but oppression of women still exists everywhere, regardless of the religion the men adhere to. A lot of Christian men do allow their women to cover their bodies, and on the other hand, many Muslim men don't allow Muslim women to cover their bodies or hair. Some examples of Muslim men oppressing their women and forcing them to expose their bodies are in Turkey and Egypt, where, despite over 90% of the population being Muslim, the government banned women from wearing a headscarf and forbade women from earning degrees or studying in higher education with their hair covered. In Turkey, hijab was banned in universities and public buildings until as recent as 2014. Women in Turkey would have their clothing and head coverings ripped off in public and humiliated and evicted from government buildings. This mode of oppression is not unique to Europe and America, but men in general had been oppressing women throughout the Muslim and non-Muslim world. In fact, since women were banned from entering universities with their headscarves, many women, including the First Lady of Turkey, had to give up education in order to retain their right to conceal private parts of their bodies. Misogynist behavior is not unique to atheist men, Christian men, or Muslim men, but it is a trend that vilifies women across the religious and irreligious spectrum. Oppressing women is a problem that are relevant to men in general, whether they are Muslim or not, and anyone who forces a woman to strip off her clothing at gunpoint deserves as a danger to our civilized society. They deserve the greatest punishment for taking away a woman's right to cover whichever parts of her body she wishes to hide from the public or from lewd male gaze. To some women, exposing the hair is akin to be forced to walk in the street topless or without trousers. Forcing women to uncover her hair, her chest or her private parts is the most grievous and heinous crime which many people of our time are guilty of. It is just as shameful and outrageous to ask a woman to uncover her hair as it is to asking a woman to bare her breasts or uncover her private parts. For a woman who wishes to remain modest, it is as unthinkable to expose her hair as it is to take off her trousers. France, a nation that prides itself in being an exemplary democracy, were the first to ban women from covering their bodies properly. The government ruled those Muslim women who try to cover their hair or wear a long skirt to school will be fined severely or face imprisonment. It seems that the world is slowly regressing back to the pre-World War II days, where women in India were not allowed to cover their breast, as men who ruled those Indian Hindu cities determined which parts of the body a woman may cover and which parts they should keep on display for men to gawk over. French laws are also decreeing which body parts women must reveal to men, whether they wish to or not. For men, no such restrictions exist, as they are free to wear bicycle helmets, face masks, and even winter hats in public, but Muslim women will be fined and punished severely if they try to wrap a fashionable scarf around their heads. If this discriminatory trend aimed at Muslim women continues in France and the rest of Europe, then it is possible that bizarre laws such as banning women from wearing long skirts or trousers or even shirts may be slowly banned in the name of freedom. As Muslim French and European women struggle to conform to a religious lifestyle, simultaneously demonstrating that the modest lifestyle is a cognition, they endorse nonconformity in wearing a headscarf. While adopting the scarf may be viewed as an act of religious solidarity, most women feel they are exhibiting aesthetic solidarity by exhibiting inflammatory style that startles the mainstream as opposed to breeding antipathy, but could be a postulation of tolerant intimation in their world. Some liberals frowned upon the appropriation of headscarves, claiming it symbolized women's oppression, but many Muslim women feel that the scarf is a fashion statement that was effective in securing attention, but it was excruciating to the standards of an emerging sub-society. 1400 years ago, Islam was introduced to the world by a man named Muhammad, who declared that every man and woman was equal before the sight of God. Islam was the first religion that banned slavery and forbade men from hurting or insulting women. However, in 6th century Arabia, many Christian and Zoroastrian kingdoms continued to mistreat and beat their women because their religions allowed such primitive practices. Why did some religions endorse beating women? Recent research shows that the men most likely to abuse their wives are evangelical Christians who attend church regularly. Some church leaders discourage abuse of any kind. But advocates say the church is not only failing to sufficiently address domestic violence, but are both enabling and concealing it by preaching verses of the Bible which promote violence against women. Passages from the Bible are often quoted in sermons, such as the following excerpt from Ephesians. Wives, submit to your own husbands, as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Or verses like the one in Timothy 2, that call on women to learn in silence with all submissiveness. It states that God permits no woman to teach or have authority over a man, rather, she is to remain silent. The fact that domestic violence occurs in church communities is well established, and it is likely that misogynistic ideology in the Bible is inevitably endorsing such violent behavior. However, Christian laws were significantly kinder to women than Roman laws. The laws of ancient Rome law, like the laws of ancient Athens law, profoundly disfavored women. Roman citizenship was tiered, and women were not on par with men. Roman society was sexist and extremely patriarchal. The law prohibited women from voting, standing for public office, serving in civic priesthoods, or in any capacity in the Roman military. Women were always under the legal control of some man, her father, her husband, or her legal guardian. All children, born of marriage, were the exclusive possession of their father, who could force the daughter to enter any marriage and had the authority of life and death over the wife and children. For thousands of years, Roman laws, English laws, and American laws legally gave men the right to beat their wives. Under Roman law, men had the power of life and death over their wives, and in Athenian law, husband had the ultimate authority to punish the wife for misconduct and could determine any punishment for his wife. Legally, he could pass death sentence on a wife for stealing the keys to his wine cellar. In the 19th century, American courts gave husbands the right to beat their wives for committing any acts of misconduct. Pioneering women attacked the common law of wife-beating, but were unsuccessful in their efforts. They condemned the laws that legalized wife-beating, but could do little to amend it. Physically abused wives found it very difficult to escape marriage due to stringent divorce laws that did not accept beating as a ground for divorce. Those American and English laws that allowed men to beat women considered wife beating to be illogical and even productive practice in society, and in that vein, beating children was also considered to be legal and even admirable. It is likely that this mindset stemmed from the Christian belief most citizens of these nations espoused, since the Bible condones the use of corporal punishment. Many Christians of that time cited passages from Bible's proverb that claims that he who spares his rod hates his son, but he that loveth him chastens him bettams diligently. Why did Christian men beat their wives? Christian beliefs were likely the guiding values for those men who beat their wives and children. Judges and lawyers would often quote Bible's verses that announced, "Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. If you strike him with a rod, you will save his soul from Sheol." In studying the legal heritage of the American colonies which condoned wife beating, we observe that state Supreme Courts excused husbands from charges of assault when they hit, beat, punched or whipped their wives. The aim of these legal decisions was to ensure husbands had absolute authority over wives and are able to forcefully discipline women. The common law placed American and English women at a great disadvantage in marriage, and legalizing the scourging wives was only a way of expressing that women in general were inferior to men. Some husbands, however, allowed wives personal freedom and treated women with generosity, but this was due to individual benevolence and not a legal requirement. In the late 1800s, many women complained that wife beating was a violation of their human rights. Until modern times, European and American men who beat their wives remained unchallenged by the legal system that governed them. The origins of these American family laws that permitted wife beating traces back to English laws, which in turn was inspired by the Roman laws. The legal system of the Roman Empire established absolute authority of the husband and gave fathers and husband absolute authority, including the power of life and death, and uncontrolled corporal chastisement over wife, children and other family members. Until 1920, courts in New Hampshire, Maryland and other nearby states denied divorce decree on grounds of cruelty. The North Carolina Supreme Court also ruled that horsewhipping and switching by a husband were not legal grounds for divorce. It would be another decade before American women could sue for divorce. Domestic violence laws that guided U.S. courts can be traced back to 753 BC, where, during the reign of Romulus in Rome, wife beating was accepted and condoned under the laws of chastisement. These laws permitted the husband to beat his wife with a rod. English common law explicitly permitted wife beating for correctional purposes. The husband was allowed to freely whip his wife. However, during the late 1800s, some American states began to amend these violent laws. In 1882, Maryland became the first state to pass a law that made wife beating a crime, punishable by 40 lashes. Laws against women, however, were not an invention of the United States of America. English laws set precedent for such amendments to take place. The De Heretico Comburendo was a law passed by Parliament under King Henry IV of England in 1401, punishing heretics with burning at the stake. However, 14 centuries earlier, Islam's founder Muhammad announced to the world that all men and women were equal before God, and every human being was free to worship as they pleased. Speaking ill of God or the Prophet was not punishable under Muslim practices, because Islam invites others to question this faith and its tenets. Maiming, torturing, or burning people who reject the Islamic faith is strictly forbidden by the Islamic God, and the Quran's 5th chapter announces, "Do not let the hatred of people prevent you from being just. Be just." And elsewhere in the Quran it is mentioned that God loves those who act justly. The Islamic prophet taught people that the hallmark of a Muslim is that he, if wronged by others, does not flare up in anger and does not lose his self-control. Rather, he forgives the wrongdoers from the depths of his heart. These Islamic laws were, however, not followed in Europe, and thousands of people were constantly suffering from religious persecution under both Catholic and Protestant leaders. In 1378, Pope Gregory XI commanded the persecution of John Wycliffe and the Lollards for voicing their dissent. This allowed the torture and murder of many innocent Protestant leaders. A decade later, King Henry IV passed laws in 1400 that enabled the torture and imprisonment of heretics. It allowed the bishops to arrest all preachers of heresy, all schoolmasters infected with heresy, and all owners and writers of heretical books. On refusal to solemnly renounce their faith, the heretic would be paraded before the public and there be burnt in a huge fire. Hundreds of people were hanged and burned in England between 1414 and 1506 due to blasphemy, and this list included a number of prominent women, notably the Protestant preacher Anne Askew, who was brutally tortured in the Tower of London, and in June of 1546, Anne was burned at the stake as a heretic by the order of King Henry VIII. Many fellow Protestants in England were outraged by the treatment meted out to Anne, particularly because she was tortured in the rack and stretched violently until her bones and limbs were completely broken. Anne Askew was terribly handicapped, but this did not prevent the English courts to order her execution, and despite the excruciating pain she was suffering from, she was carried to the stake by the guards and burned alive in front of a jeering English mob. When the former Archbishop of Canterbury briefly abandoned his Catholic faith, he was sentenced to death for blasphemy. But he later recanted his Protestant faith on March of 1556 in order to be spared being burned at the stake. Despite these recantations, Queen Mary I refused to pardon him, and he was burned alive for heresy. After the death of King Henry, his daughter, Queen Mary of England, continued to persecute people under English blasphemy laws. 1556, Peregrine Massey and her sister, Gilliman Gilbert, and their mother, Catherine Couches, were charged with receiving a stolen goblet, but the women were found not guilty. However, during the trial it was recorded that the women had not been attending church, and therefore all three women were found guilty of heresy and condemned to be burned at the stake. Peregrine was pregnant, but Catholics in the 16th century thought it was acceptable to kill the unborn and therefore execute pregnant women. The women were burnt on the same fire, but the belly of the pregnant woman burst by the impact of the flame, and her child fell into the ground. But when onlookers expressed desire to rescue the child, the executioner ordered the infant to be carried back again and cast into the fire. Many years after Queen Mary's demise, the English courts continued to punish citizens for blasphemy. However, 14 centuries ago, Islam forbade torture and burning. It also banned people from hurting women in any way or form. Muslim women were also granted the right to wear whatever she desired and cover her body the way she wished. However, the same cannot be said for modern-day women in Europe, who have become victims to a deeply patriarchal society that punished women for covering her body. If a woman covers her face with a veil in the Netherlands, she will face a fine of at least €150. The ban applies to burqas and other veils. In 2005, the Dutch parliament voted in favor of a proposal for a complete ban on burqas that had been introduced by right-wing lawmaker Geert Wilders. Face veils have been illegal in Denmark since 2018. People who break the law face fines of up to €135, which can increase significantly for repeat offenders. It is designed to force women to keep herself exposed. Face veils have also been banned in Austria since 2017, under a law known as the Law Against Wearing Face Veils. The law requires women to show their facial features. If women refuse to expose themselves, then they face a fine of up to €150. Like the Netherlands, Bulgaria introduced a burqa ban in 2016. Wearers face a fine of up to €750 if they break it. Those countries which force women to uncover themselves do not ban hats or masks for men, and this shows that the laws against women are tailored to take away the basic human rights from female citizens of the world. Countries like France, Spain, Belgium, Italy, Germany, and other European countries that fine or jail women for covering themselves do not punish men for the same crime. Men are permitted to wear helmets and ride bicycles or fly planes. They are allowed to wear hats when serving in the army, but women do not have the privilege of covering her hair. Belgium is another one of those European countries which have banned veils in public since July 2011. Anyone who breaks the law risks a fine or up to several weeks in jail. The ban affects Muslim women and those women who wish to dress modestly. Belgium, which is home to around 1 million Muslims, continues this pre-medieval patriarchal practice until today. Many schools in England are kicking out Muslim girls for refusing to wear a shorter skirt on religious grounds, which the administration says violated the school's dress code. Recently, a 12-year-old wore an ankle-length skirt to school before it became a disciplinary issue. The school's uniform code requires female students to wear pleated, short, school-issue skirts, but she was thrown out of her school for not wearing a shorter skirt. All the young girl wanted to do was to wear a skirt which is a few centimeters longer than her classmates, but the school was adamant and sent her home. No man in the world should have the right or audacity to dictate what kind of clothes a woman may wear. Yet, we see it happening in many places. It is the greatest misfortune that in this century, where most people have finally achieved many rights, women have become the victims of male dominance. Never before in the modern world did women face such oppression before, where their clothing is dictated by men. France was the first European country to ban Muslim women from wearing a face veil in public with a corresponding law in April 2011. Religious clothing has been banned in French schools since 2004, including headscarves. Muslim teenagers were repeatedly sent home for their long skirt, which teachers felt conspicuously showed their religious affiliation. Many other European countries have banned the full face veil, including Germany, Switzerland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Norway. Parts of Spain have introduced local bans. Italy has had a general ban on clothes that mask the wearer's identity since the 1970s. Pre-medieval Europe had similar misogynistic patriarchal laws ingrained in their system. One such example can be seen in Mesopotamia. Used as a means of identifying which women are respectable and which women are publicly available to men, upper-class women in ancient Mesopotamia were forced to wear veils that are wrapped loosely over their waists, but poor women are not allowed to cover themselves. Those poor women faced harsh punishments if they dared to cover themselves in any way. In another misogynistic move, numerous countries in Europe had banned Muslim women from wearing full-sleeve bathing suit, also known as the burkini. More than 20 towns in the south of France decided to ban the burkini and force Muslim women on beaches to remove their headscarves along the coast. Photos emerged of armed police surrounding one woman and forcing her to undress on the beach in front of hundreds of strangers, and some human rights groups protested in her defense, claiming that forcibly stripping a woman is a violation of her rights. Muslim women don't see their scarf as a symbol of oppression, but the women I interviewed were adamant that wearing a headscarf or a full-sleeved bathing suit was their choice and basic human right. It seems that the head covering trend Muslim women assimilate serves to shift concentration from the symbol of subjugation into a sign of liberation, inadvertently thrusting religious women into the spotlight as ambassadors of religious tolerance. The hijabis I interviewed felt being able to wear a headscarf was a rejuvenating gesture, while a freelance writer and feminist, who wore a headscarf in public, declared, "My hijab has nothing to do with oppression. It's a feminist statement." Whether they displayed a symbolic nostalgia in their choices, headscarf-clad Muslims and non-Muslims vied for uncanny hegemony in the world of subterranean subcultures. While everyone has his own cultural interpretations to a style, the woman wearing scarves subverted the meaning of subjugation and insubordination. Misogynistic laws were not foreign to Italy, where rapists could walk free if they could prove that their victims were wearing tight jeans. In 1992, the Italian Supreme Court overturned the conviction of a convicted rapist after his lawyers proved that the victim was wearing tight jeans. The defense argued that wearing a jeans must have meant the act of rape was consensual. The Italian Supreme Court agreed. Puerto Rico was not too tolerant of women choosing her own clothing. Prior to the Second World War, women were not permitted to wear trousers. Luisa Capetillo, a writer and activist from Puerto Rico who believed that women should have the same rights as men, wore a suit as an act of defiance. After wearing a man's suit in public, she was sent to jail. These days, many countries are sending women to jail for daring to cover herself. Proponents of the headscarf ban argue fiercely that it liberates women, while opponents of the ban declare that it was a violation of human rights to ban someone from covering their body in public. Oppression of women in the United Kingdom was not limited to being whipped or beaten or burned at the stake, but women were also forced to cover themselves. In 1890 and early 1900, it was decided in the UK that women must cover their whole bodies in public. Necklines had to be raised to just below the chin, and hemlines dropped to below the ankle. Diagrams were released to clarify what length of skirt was suitable for what age. According to British laws, 4-year-old girls could wear dresses to just below the knee, but girls of 16 had to wear dresses to the arch of their foot. Legs of wooden tables were ordered to be covered up too, because they apparently resembled women's legs. Such patriarchal laws continued to plague women until recently. And those who pull off a woman's scarf on the public streets and parks may even start to rip off the pants or underwear off a woman, because violating women's privacy have become a norm in many cities of Europe. Those who forcibly undress and strip women at gunpoint claim they are enforcing the rights of women to uncover, even if she is vehemently against remaining nude. True feminism and women's rights should be to allow a woman to wear whatever she desires and covering whichever part of her body she chooses to. Forcibly stripping woman and tearing off her clothes in public is akin to unlawfully sexually assaulting her. The Muslim prophet Muhammad called on all men to treat women with honor and respect, but many modern cities do not adhere to this moral code. Those countries that ban women from covering their bodies criticize Islam for allowing women to wear whatever she chooses. This is due to the fact that Islam is the most misinterpreted religion in the world, particularly because of historical inaccuracies that had been spreading for a long time. Arabs in pre-Islamic Arabia would often spread false information about Muhammad and his followers, and some of those stories inadvertently ended up becoming parts of religious booklets, and those false accounts were even adopted by some Muslim scholars who thought those to be authentic prophetic narrations. Hence, in order to understand the Islamic religion, it is necessary to study only the Quran, as this has never been altered in any way. Unfortunately, since many of the followers of Islam also believe in the false propaganda, I made this video after considerable discussions with archaeologists and historians as well as Muslim scholars who pointed out to me the numerous inconsistencies in many theological books. I aim to discuss an aspect of Islam that has been grossly misunderstood, and that is beating a fellow man or woman. Recent media attention on the idea of sex slavery and wife beating raised many questions about this subject. Is wife beating legal in Islam? What did Muslim prophet Muhammad have to say on the topic of domestic violence? Few people concern themselves with approaching the religious texts with an open mind or studying the holy books objectively, but content themselves with their own, often biased, interpretation of the faith. In this brief presentation, we will attempt to go over a few of the most controversial and least understood topics in Islam. 1,450 years ago, when Islam came on the scene, it nullified and negated the practice of female oppression. No ruler or progenitor was allowed to treat his subjects or offspring as his slaves. Every individual was bestowed with well-defined rights. The ruler and the ruled, the progenitor and the offspring had to live within the limits prescribed by religion. No one could transgress those limits. Islam was the first religion to name every man and woman equal in the sight of God. Everyone was born free. There was no slavery system in Islam until pagans started taking Muslims as slaves. Those Muslims who were not protected by powerful tribes were captured and sold to enemies who killed, tortured, and persecuted them mercilessly. Finally, God allowed Muslims to take captives only in wars, and that too under complex rules, which included that prisoner of war must be treated gently and must be fed the same foods his captors ate, must be clothed in the same fabric, and lodged in a similar housing. And it drastically restricted war by allowing imprisonment only in a war that was being fought against an unbelieving and unjust enemy. In no other way could anyone be enslaved. At the same time, Islam raised the status of slavery to that of a free man and opened many ways for their emancipation. In Islam, no one was permitted to have sexual relations with their slaves. However, in countries throughout Europe, North America, and Australia, it was a commonplace occurrence, and also sanctioned by government laws, to sexually assault their slaves, especially the women, which was practiced in a mass scale and completely legal until a few decades and century ago. The laws of Islam span a vast horizon, where hospitality, kindness, assisting the wayfarer, and sheltering the orphan are religious obligations. Islam came in Arabia at a time when Europe was in the Dark Ages, having entered the early medieval period, with present-day civilizations like Britain and France ruled sparingly by Anglo-Saxon and Brythonic kingdoms, who themselves were trying to recover from economic and dogmatic depressions. Women and minorities faced harsh laws on a daily basis at this time and could enjoy little rights. The division of social privileges remained rooted until much later. The British author and commentator Karen Armstrong elucidated the plight of women in the Middle Ages in her book, Muhammad, a biography of the Prophet. She writes that Muslims were horrified to see the way Western Christians treated their women in the Crusader states, and Christian scholars denounced Islam for giving too much power to menials like slaves and women. Athenian laws also restricted women's monetary freedom by barring them from engaging in legal contracts or appearing in law courts. Slaves and foreign citizens had little rights under Roman laws, and even free women did not have the right to vote. During the Renaissance, the rights of women did not improve, and incidentally it was at this time that two of the wives of Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, were beheaded for adultery and improper conduct respectively. Until 1900, a woman's property would belong to her husband upon marriage. As for inheritance, a daughter could inherit no real property in the presence of a male heir, who would inherit the father's property in its entirety. From the actions of the past few centuries, we have seen how laws were blended with autocratic regimes and were used to justify atrocities. What was legal then may not have been necessarily right. Slavery was once legal in America, as was segregation, despite a functional democratic government wielding authority, not to mention in World War II era of Europe, when Holocaust was legal in Germany, and the democratically elected government in Nazi Germany passed the Nuremberg laws for the protection of German blood and German honor in September of 1935 that embodied Nazi ideology and provided the legal framework for the systematic persecution of Jews in Germany and enabled the murders of millions of civilian women and children. Islam continues to be the most misinterpreted and misjudged faith in this century. It is particularly imperative that people should know Islam as to what it really is and learn it from those who are actively involved in attaining and articulating it, such as qualified Islamic scholars and jurists, so that they are not deprived completely of the great virtues and enlightenment of Islamic law and not be blinded by ignorance and bias. Islamic laws are a way to ensure the protection of women, because although Holocaust and slavery are now illegal, in the course of time, one cannot be certain if it is going to stay that way. One example of such a case of modern law's regression is found in the recent French mission against Muslim women who choose to wear long-sleeved shirts to beaches. Up to now, numerous women have been charged with hefty fines for covering their bodies, while the less fortunate ones were forcibly undressed at gunpoint as French police zealously attempted to maintain order by enforcing recently passed French laws which banned women from wearing coverings in beaches. As a result of such a vulnerable legal structure within the network of Western civilizations, basic freedom of many were curtailed. In Europe, women also faced disadvantages in other spheres of life. In England, burning was a legal punishment inflicted on women found guilty of high treason, petty treason and heresy. During the 1600s, King James VI of Scotland's fear of witchcraft caused him to legalize the torture and burning of any woman who was suspected of being a witch. Why was corporal punishment practiced in Europe? The lashing of criminals and women in Germany, Denmark, Holland, and England were also a grievous practice in Europe. In England, the Whipping Act of 1530 authorized the whipping of thieves, blasphemers, poachers, men and women guilty of minor offenses, and even the insane. Victims were generally tied to the end of a cart as police whipped them, flogging people with great brutality. The backs of the condemned were frequently lacerated, and salt was poured into the wounds to increase the pain. At the end of the 19th century, imprisonment gradually replaced some of the corporal penalties as a punishment for crime, but the courts retained the power to order whippings. Whipping and flogging was still the norm in England and Wales until 1967. During the late 18th century, the whip was used in Denmark and Holland. German felons were flogged out of town, and warders in the French penal colonies in the 1920s employed riding whips. Corporal punishment was a very popular practice in England and was adopted by the U.S. courts. Criminals would be regularly whipped for petty crimes. However, this practice ended when the state of Delaware abolished the practice in 1972. Flogging, mutilation and amputation was common in the Crusader states, the most well-known being the Anti-Sacrilege Act, a French law against blasphemy and sacrilege that passed in April 1825 under King Louis XVII's government and enacted into law by King Charles X. The French government decreed those uttering profanities or insulting Christian beliefs would be punishable by death. Criticizing holy objects was punishable by death or a sentence of perpetual forced labor. Uttering blasphemous speech would also result in the cutting off the right hand followed by decapitation. King Louis of France, who was known as Saint Louis, also punished blasphemy, and he would cut off the lips of anyone who spoke ill of Jesus or criticized Christianity. Women were treated terribly in those European cities. From before the 13th century, men used iron girdle or chastity belts to ensure their wives were faithful. In Germany, many husbands insisted their women should wear a metal belt to prevent them from having sex, and this idea of the chastity belt dates back to medieval times, when men would lock up their daughters to ensure their virginity. Those excruciatingly painful belts were used frequently during the Crusades, when men would leave their wives to fight in wars. While they were gone, wives would be outfitted with painfully designed chastity belts to prevent infidelity and preserve faithfulness until their husbands returned with the key. This sort of demeaning practice was considered a norm in Christian Europe and England. However, forcing women or men to don such materials of discomfort and indignity is prohibited in Islam, and this practice is severely condemned by the Muslim scholars. While beating wives and children were legal in Crusader and other European and American states, Islam prohibited corporal punishment more than 1400 years ago. Violence of any kind directly violates Islamic religious laws, and those who falsely claim Islam condones the abuse of women are sadly mistaken, or perhaps they confuse the biblical verses with the Quran. One such misunderstanding is the practice of polygamy, which many people mistakenly associate with Islam. Polygamy existed among the Israelites before the time of Moses, who continued the institution without imposing any limit on the number of marriages which a Hebrew husband might contract. In primitive Jewish society, polygamy was a well-established institution, dating from the most ancient times and extending to comparatively modern days. Another common practice was the taking of concubines. In later times, however, the Old Testament or the Talmud of Jerusalem restricted the number of wives a Jew could marry. Some rabbis counseled that a man should not take more than 4 wives. Among the Mediterranean Jews living in Yemen, rabbis permitting them to marry up to 4 wives. The practice of taking 4 wives is often connected with Islam, but as actuality, polygamy was permitted under Jewish laws, not Islam. Since polygamy is illegal in Islam, there is a rule within the religious laws of Islam that when a girl gets married, she can put anything in the contract with her husband, as long as it does not go against obligatory Islamic laws such as daily prayers or giving alms. Aside from that, a woman can't add anything to the contract except for time, that is a marriage for a certain period of time. She can totally put the agreement that her husband cannot take another wife, as long as he is married to her. And as long as the husband is a Muslim, he has to follow the laws of Islam, and thus cannot break the promise or contract. Many Muslim and Arab women stipulate specific details in their contracts when they get married. Islam also prohibits governments or men from forcing women to cover or uncover her body, as clothing is a woman's sovereign choice. But many nations in the world are involved in the vile practice of insulting women. If a woman wants to cover her face with a scarf in order to hide from an abusive husband, then forcing her to uncover her hair and face is a violation of her rights, and the man who forces her to do so, on the mere grounds that she is a woman, is violating her rights and should be punished most severely with a life sentence. Forcing a woman to wear a muffler, beanie hat, a face mask, or a scarf is morally wrong, but it is certainly a lot better than forcing a woman to uncover her private parts. Although forcing a woman to cover is an oppression, but forcing her to uncover is a lot more oppression. In the past centuries, and in pre-medieval Europe, women were treated like animals and did not have the right to cover her body. Polygamy was practiced rampantly, and women and children were discarded. In the 4th century, the Roman emperor authorized Christians to take 2 wives. In the 8th century, Charlemagne, holding power over both church and state, practiced polygamy, having 6, or according to some authorities, 9 wives. Germany also legalized and even encouraged the practice of polygamy. On February 14, 1650, the Parliament at Nuremberg decreed that, because so many men were killed during the 30 Years' War, that every man was allowed to marry up to 10 women. Early in its history, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints practiced polygamy in America. In the United States, polygamy is illegal today, but it exists unofficially, with an estimated 100,000 people living as polygamists in the West. Typically, these families are Mormon fundamentalists or Christian groups that maintain polygamy as a time-honored and scriptural practice. Before Islam, women were considered shameful, female children were buried alive, prostitution was rampant, divorce was only in the hands of the husband, inheritance was only for the strong, and oppression was widespread. Islam came and abolished these practices. Even now, in developed countries, women are not granted respect, dignity, and honor, let alone equal pay for equal work. Islam, however, regards women as precious and valuable, not to be disrespected, beaten, or disgraced. The mistreatment of women in some Middle Eastern countries or Muslim families is due to cultural factors that some Muslims wrongly follow, not because of Islam. But the mistreatment of women is not unique to Asia, Middle East, and Africa. Women are still being the victim of male dominance in every sphere of life. In the past centuries, and in pre-medieval Europe, women were treated like animals and did not have the right to cover her body. Polygamy was practiced rampantly, and women and children were discarded. In the 4th century, the Roman emperor authorized Christians to take 2 wives. In the 8th century, Charlemagne, holding power over both church and state, practiced polygamy, having 6, or according to some authorities, 9 wives. Germany also legalized and even encouraged the practice of polygamy. On February 14, 1650, the Parliament at Nuremberg decreed that, because so many men were killed during the 30 Years' War, that every man was allowed to marry up to 10 women. Early in its history, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints practiced polygamy in America. In the United States, polygamy is illegal today, but it exists unofficially, with an estimated 100,000 people living as polygamists in the West. Typically, these families are Mormon fundamentalists or Christian groups that maintain polygamy as a time-honored and scriptural practice. Before Islam, women were considered shameful, female children were buried alive, prostitution was rampant, divorce was only in the hands of the husband, inheritance was only for the strong, and oppression was widespread. Islam came and abolished these practices. Even now, in developed countries, women are not granted respect, dignity, and honor, let alone equal pay for equal work. Islam, however, regards women as precious and valuable, not to be disrespected, beaten or disgraced. The mistreatment of women in some Middle Eastern countries or Muslim families is due to cultural factors that some Muslims wrongly follow, not because of Islam. But the mistreatment of women is not unique to Asia, Middle East and Africa. Women are still being the victim of male dominance in every sphere of life. According to the National Crime Victimization Survey, in the United States of America, which includes crimes that were not reported to the police, 232,960 women in the U.S. are raped or sexually assaulted in 1 year. That's more than 600 women every day. Other estimates, such as those generated by the FBI, are much higher because they collect data from various law enforcement agencies. Each year in the United States of America, around 2,000 women are murdered by an intimate partner. That's an average of 5 women every day. Of all the women murdered in the United States, about 1/3 are killed by an intimate partner. And in most cases, the culprit escapes punishment. Women ages 20 and 24 are at greatest risk of fatal domestic violence, and women aged 24 and under suffer from the highest rates of rape. The Justice Department estimates that 1 in 5 women will experience rape or attempted rape during their college years, but less than 5% of these rapes will be reported. It is unfortunate that women in this modern era are constantly being assaulted and abused by men, yet those men pass laws, making it a criminal offense for a woman to cover her body. How are women treated in today's world? Despite reaching the peak of civilization and having liberal laws in place that officially condemn violence and wife-beating, women have been experiencing assault at a similar rate. Nearly 10 million people suffer from domestic violence in America every year, and on average, 20 people are physically abused by an intimate partner per minute in the United States. The United Kingdom does not lag too far behind, and while the English common law does not officially allow husbands to beat their wives anymore, violence has not abated, with nearly 2 million women suffering some form of domestic abuse each year. Today, many countries force women to cover themselves, and some places such as the United States and Britain, among other nations, do not allow women to roam topless in universities or schools. This is a great insult to womanhood and a severe form of oppression, because a woman should always have the right to cover or uncover whichever part of her body she wishes to. However, many countries in Europe force women to keep certain parts of her body exposed, and this is an even greater kind of oppression and is much more outrageous than asking women to remain covered. As a basic rule of civilization, women must be allowed to wear whatever they want to wear. We have to silence those people who even dare to talk about how women should dress. No woman in the world should be fined or jailed for covering her body. No woman in the world should be jailed or fined for uncovering her body. Women should not be arrested for wearing a scarf on her head, and neither should she be punished for removing it on her own will. This oppressive act is done in the name of freedom of expression, but it is actually the opposite of that, because no government uses freedom of expression to force men to veil themselves or uncover their bodies. Women in Europe do not dictate what their male counterparts should wear or which body parts men should keep exposed. Thus, it is vital that men stop commenting and deciding and voting on how a woman should dress. They should not use freedom or oppression as an excuse to force women into nudity. According to the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, women experience about 5 million intimate partner-related physical assaults and rapes every year. Most women refuse to press charges against those men because of the fear of further repercussion. American and European women go through the most terrible abuse each day. Every single emergency room in the hospitals across American are filled with women who have been beaten nearly to death by their partners, but these injuries pale in comparison to the abuse many of their children face. Millions of little girls and boys are abused by their stepfathers and their mothers' boyfriends. The children are often terrified to report it, and occasionally the school teachers find out and alert the authorities. In many cases, the children deny being abused because they don't want to live in horrible government-funded orphanage. So, those innocent children continue getting abused through their childhood and teen years. In the absence of religious doctrines or Islamic laws that ensure men, women and children are treated with love and respect, many countries are facing unprecedented surge of domestic violence and other criminal activities. An example of how society's most vulnerable have become victims in today's world can be seen in Germany, where nearly 50 children are sexually abused per day, with thousands of terabytes of child pornography being uploaded and downloaded each day. Oftentimes, the perpetrators of such crimes are none other than the parent or legal guardian of those children who are abused from infancy. In a single investigation, North Rhine-Westphalia's Justice Department was able to identify over 30,000 perpetrators who were abusing children and selling the images online. However, many more sick criminals are never apprehended or found, especially because the culprits are the caregivers. Police in southwestern Germany apprehended dozens of suspects and charged them for rape, sexual abuse, forced prostitution and producing child pornography. German investigators also discovered that the abused child was sold to the abusers by his mother, who offered the boy for sex online in exchange for money, and the victim was repeatedly raped and sexually abused by a number of local and foreign men in a modern-day sex slavery pedophile ring. Before the introduction to the Islamic faith, England, as was the rest of Europe, was disinclined to grant women equal rights and opportunity. Women and men were indoctrinated from birth into believing that a woman's slave status was natural. As such, women were in those societies were excluded from literary and education. They were kept busy with menial, domestic and childbearing duties. They were forbidden to question or challenge the world around them, and were taught to remain silent and subjugated. Islam, however, made the education of women a sacred obligation. Women, far from being barred from study of Islam's holy book, were urged to learn to read it as were men. Women in Islam played an important role in the foundations of many Islamic educational institutions during the 12th and 13th centuries, when 160 mosques and universities were established in Damascus, 26 of which were funded by women, and most of all the royal patrons for these institutions were also women. According to historians of the 12th century, there were opportunities for female education in the medieval Islamic world, where women could study, earn academic degrees, and qualify as scholars and teachers. This was especially the case for learned and scholarly families who wanted to ensure the highest possible education for both their sons and daughters. Famous Muslim jurists such as Bukhari, Hanifa, and Askari studied under hundreds of different female teachers in their time. Female education in the Islamic world was inspired by Muhammad's wife and female relatives. His first wife, Khadija, was a successful businesswoman who had 11,000 men under her employment, and his second wife, Aisha, was a renowned scholar and a military general. Women under Islamic law could additionally enter into contracts, buy and sell property, sue in court on their own behalf without the need for a man to represent them, engage in commerce, and add trusts, exactly the same way a man is able to. But many centuries later, Europe was still treating women as eunuchs and slaves. It was during this time, and up till the 19th century, English men sold their wives instead of getting divorced. It was common practice for Englishmen to sell their wives in an open market in the city or countryside. Those who wanted to efficiently get rid of their wives would tie a chain around the wife's waist or neck and auction her off to the highest bidder, selling the woman for as little as a single shilling. During the 18th and 19th centuries, divorce was considerably expensive, and some poor British men found it difficult to afford it, so they sold their wives instead. Although this custom may appear degrading to us today, it was perfectly acceptable to most Europeans, and selling wives was accepted as an alternative to divorce among Britons. Wife sales was like a cattle auction at the time, and before the auction began, the husband would place a rope around his wife's neck and drag her to market or a public place, where he would auction her off after giving her specifics, like weight and age. Much like slave trade, there was no designated buyer, and actual bidding took place. The man could sell her like an ordinary farm animal. Oftentimes, a woman had no prior knowledge that she was to be sold, and in those markets, she would be bid on by total strangers. Once the wife was purchased by another man, she became his property. How were women treated in Islam? The Muslim prophet Muhammad opposed violence against women and children, and he also spoke against animal cruelty and severely reprimanded cattle owners who mistreated their herds. He never ordered to kill a single dog or cat in his entire lifetime. Despite his idealized vision for peace and stability, the pagan Arabs of Mecca were outraged by his demands. Muhammad was tortured mercilessly by pagans when he began to preach the teachings of Islam, but he never retaliated and was eventually forced to flee to nearby city of Medina. When Prophet Muhammad took over Mecca a decade later, he never took revenge against any one of his former oppressors. Muhammad continued preaching Islam to those vanquished Meccans and offered them utmost mercy and freedom, which included granting liberty especially to women and slaves, who were oppressed mercilessly by the pagan Romans and the French. Women in those societies neither had the right to inherit, nor had the right to marry on her own, or buy or sell, or own any property at the pre-Islamic period. Muhammad therefore announced that women and men had equal position in the eyes of God, and he gave them the right to inherit, buy, sell, and marry on their own. The attempt to introduce greater sexual equality to religion did not produce great results in the past, partially because some men hijacked the faith and dragged it back to the old patriarchy. This happened in both Christianity and Islam, latter-day assertion of axial age monotheism. The Prophet Muhammad, for example, was anxious to emancipate women, and they were among his first converts. In 7th century Arabia, the Quran taught people that men and women had exactly the same responsibilities and duties, and gave women rights of inheritance and divorce that we would not enjoy in the West until the 19th century. The religious law of Islamic doctrine is vehemently against all types of injustice and physical and sexual violence. Verses of the Quran elucidates the code of conduct of Islamic lifestyle, where the God of Abraham calls on people to stand against oppression, violence, and inequality. Thanks for listening. Please do subscribe for more interesting videos and presentations.